All right. Thank you again for being here today. We see a lot of familiar faces and names. And for those of you who have joined us before, you know to put your names and your affiliation in the chat, or your campus affiliation. And then if you're joining for the first time, please do that as well. We primarily do that. I know there are folks here who are receiving professional development credit on our campus, and we want to make sure that you receive that credit. So I just want to say thank you for being here today. My name is Patty Robinson. I am the the faculty director of Civic and Community Engagement at College of the Canyons, and I am joined by my colleagues Kimberly, Jan, and Rebecca. Kimberly and Jan are from Cerritos College. Kimberly is the chair of the Education Department and chair of Women and Gender Studies. Jan is emeritus and adjunct at Cerritos and the 3CSN facilitator. And a huge thank you to Rebecca, who is here from 3CSN, who is our tech person and who is recording our session and will make it available through 3CSN as an archived recording. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, and I see a lot of new names, we began the Civic Dialogue series in fall 2020 as part of an intersegmental partnership addressing how to create a civic engagement pathway between the California Community College system and the California State University system. The work was part of a Bringing Theory to Practice grant, and then transitioned into a second Bringing Theory to Practice grant that we're now working on with several CSUs and several community colleges, including obviously Cerritos and College of the Canyons. We started this, quite frankly, as a way to try and bring greater awareness within the community college system of civic learning and democratic engagement. And we thought the best way to do this was to try this virtual kind of series. Again, came out of COVID. We weren't sure how this would work, but it has worked out tremendously well. And we've continued it now for multiple semesters, and we will continue to do so in the future. It's a way of bringing together some of our nation's leading scholars, researchers, and practitioners to talk about civic learning and democratic engagement. As I said, presentations are also recorded and they are made available on the 3CSN website or their YouTube channel. The presentation is set up in two parts today. We have our guest speaker who will talk for the first hour, and then Kimberly, Jan, and I will meet with those folks who would like to stay on for a deeper dive to go into the topics that really resonated most with them. We have three guiding frameworks. We want to advance understanding of the intersection between equity, agency, civic engagement to promote the public good. We also want to recognize civic community and democratic engagement as a high impact practice and how it's connected to guided pathways. And we also want to leverage your own knowledge and talents as participants to build capacity to innovate for local and global change. And with that, it's my extreme honor to introduce someone I've known now since he was a student at College of the Canyons, and this is Sebastian Cazares. And I'd like to go ahead and read Sebastian's bio, and then he is going to present. Sebastian is part of our board, or I should say is a member of our board of trustees for the Santa Clarita Community College District. Sebastian was elected to the board of trustees in 2020. He is the youngest serving trustee in the California Community College system. Before joining the board, he held the position of president of College of the Canyons Associated Student Government, as well as served on the college's Independent Citizens Bond Oversight Committee. Sebastian is passionate about issues concerning community college students, especially food insecurity, housing affordability, and topics of mental health. A longtime resident of the Santa Clarita Valley here in California, he is a graduate of College of the Canyons, and Sebastian is currently completing his undergraduate studies in political science at the University of California, Los Angeles, and he plans to graduate this semester. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sebastian, and thank you very much. And I lost Sebastian on my screen here, but I know he's there somewhere.
Can you see me, Patty? Good, okay. First, I want to say I think there's a cold or allergies going around, so I might be a little nasally, which I'm so upset about because this is like the big event, and I'm out here possibly sounding congested. That's disappointing. Um, but anyways, yeah, my name is Sebastian Cáceres. I am 21 years old. I ran for office. I started running for office at a 19-year-old. I became civically involved the age of 15. I know that for some people that's kind of like this, like, whoa, some people find it shocking. Like I never was involved at that age, or maybe that's abnormal or something like that. But at least in my experience, and a lot of people in our generation who are involved in maybe social justice things or young leadership, it wasn't necessarily like a choice. By that I mean like much of our environments and our upbringings and the conditions that are occurring in this country kind of put us in these leadership roles or that desire to make change at a young age, because we had our generation has some, in my opinion, some messes to clean up um, in this country. I started as a high school student. One of my first civic engagement endeavors was the March for Our Lives. That created this very like unprecedented student turnout when it came to protests and marches. And that also had a very personal impact on me because it was kind of close to home. I'll explain a bit of that later. I gave speeches throughout my high school career. I was a super active speech and debate individual, and I was all over the Model UN circuit. And I remember I competed competitively on the Model UN team and stuff like that. So I always was like a, a, a a speech and debate kind of person. I always like articulating and arguing about important topics. But then I started actually going into the actual community and actual community organizing itself. One of my first exposures before a little bit more of like political activism was uh, just like little things like community service, like the Rotary Club. And my colleague here, Trustee Mike Berger, is actually here. He was part of the Rotary Club too. That was one of my first times I met him. So that was something that was part of my experience as well. Um, but as a student, much of things were a product of this climate and things that I guess were personal um, for me. And I also want to make sure that, being an agent of change and focusing on the California community college system, I don't want to get necessarily too partisan or um, get or like put any kind of agenda or anything like that too much of an extent. But it's just the reality that the political climate of this country is what forced me to become so active at a young age, and much of that had to do with the climate for racial justice and things like that. It was what really propelled me and mobilized me for a lot of things. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it's relevant to say that the individuals that were leading the movement for George Floyd and the individuals that were just leading campaigns for, marginalized students, marginalized communities, et cetera, were often community college students. And I think there's this kind of lack of discussion of that, and individuals still have this kind of stigmatization sometimes of community college students not being active or being lazy or yada yada yada, or just this disconnect because there's a different environment than maybe the UC system or the CSU system. I reject that narrative. I think that community college students are at the forefront and are the trailblazers when it comes to mobilization, historically speaking. Um, and I think what we've saw and my own experiences throughout these years for students being involved in civic engagement and voter registration and political campaigns or marching, whatever it may be, I had noticed that people who were at the front lines of those struggles were often community college students. And even historically too, during the civil rights era and different times, the 1960s and stuff like that, some of the most, uh, organizations that were shaking stuff up the most were community college students. Actually, like the Black Panthers were community college students up in the Bay Area. Um, just kind of providing some of that insight. I'll try to tell my story a little bit more too, but I just want to kind of highlight the fact that, and obviously I think that we as leaders can it's important to listen to all sides and respect all different opinions. And I don't want to, I think oftentimes like partisan politics and some of these messy issues on the national level gets way too involved on the local community college level. And I feel like another reason why I was actually impassioned for community colleges and running on that was because I felt like getting through some of the mess of the different national debates and stuff like that affecting my own local community could be just as important, just as powerful too. And I feel like I think that's a very exciting concept too for individuals that want to make change, that you can create change. And I think in many ways you can affect more change than you can maybe on a campaign or in some kind of cause that's, you know, people always associated with only like Congress or something like that. But on the local level, in your own educational institution or whatever it may be, that can be just as tangible of a positive impact too if you get involved too. So I don't want to just make this about just polarizing topics. However, with my own development and with a variety of things and with the much of the movement that propelled me to being elected and individuals who campaigned for me, it's still relevant for my story. I'll talk, I guess, a little bit about some of my own story a little bit more too. On my father's side, they're Mexican immigrants from the Coachella Valley. Old school Coachella. Before Coachella was cool, before you go to Coachella now, everybody's like, ooh, Coachella, the festival, and everyone's turning up, and it's super exciting. It was back in the day when nobody wanted to go to Coachella. That was my family's origins. On my father's side, they were braceros too, and my own uncle was a brown beret. My abuelito marched with Cesar Chavez, and my other uncle was called Cesar Chavez's bodyguard. They were involved in the Huelga strikes. And it's interesting because Cesar Chavez Day is pulling up in like a week or so. So maybe it's the time's a little bit relevant. The foundations of that movement and that thirst for change too, that nonviolent struggle that relied on spiritualism too, that influenced me from a young age too. On my mother's side, we're part of a very, very rare group of Puerto Ricans from Hawaii, from the Kingdom of Hawaii. So instead of going to the Bronx or Florida or any of that, in 1901, only 5,000 Puerto Ricans were recruited, or I don't know if I want to say recruited. It was, you could argue, it was like indentured servitude. There were some crazy labor conditions back then on the plantations. But 5,000 Puerto Ricans were recruited to Hawaii in 1901. That was my family. And only 0.1% of the entire global Puerto Rican population actually has a Hawaii upbringing. And so my family has 5-6 generations raised with the Hawaiian culture. So I dance hula and salsa, which is a pretty unique kind of thing. If anybody's free, I'm going to be on the UCLA hula team May 15th. If anybody wants to see the moves too, just point that out. But that also, not only did that kind of influence my own perspective from a multicultural perspective, having a unique kind of view on the world because of this upbringing, it also just kind of shaped my need for change and my look on society too. For example, not only coming from knowing what it's like to say come from an immigrant struggle or something like that, even though I had a variety of privileges and the Santa Clarita Valley had a tremendously good school system, was a very safe community, and I was very privileged in life to have experienced that. But some of my perspectives always saw the different side and the side of maybe the downtrodden or the little guy and stuff like that. And so when there was example of fight for DACA or undocumented students, that again, the California community college system was leading on, and students were mobilizing when DACA was threatened to pass policies for undocumented student centers and undocu-series for community college students. That was led by individuals and student governments and advocates on the California community college system, and that had an impact statewide. And say, for example, struggles like that felt a little bit more personal because of my history. My mom's side too, having that kind of perspective was very influential on my own kind of politicalization and my own viewpoints on just the world. The island of Puerto Rico was going through this like massive kind of like human rights travesty during Hurricane Maria, and it was personal to me because I had family on the island, and I blamed, or I don't want to say blamed, but I attributed a lot of those injustices that happened to them to the political climate of our nation's leaders. And I felt this kind of calling to act. On top of that, being from Hawaii is an area that has been historically colonized and gentrified. and where indigenous people have been exploited. And so those kind of perspectives to me very much shaped my own kind of views. On top of that too, that all kind of got me riled up and speaking at a young age in high school. Then on top of that, when I entered the community college system, I mentioned earlier, one of the first civic things that happened to me that really pushed youth mobilization at this kind of unprecedented rate was the March for Our Lives. I was an alumni of Saugus High School. If people don't know, in Saugus High School, and if it's a sensitive topic or the trigger warning for anybody, if possible, my high school was shot, and it was one of the nation's only school shootings. It was an international, national tragedy. I was very, very close to the situation. And so when that happened, that was one of the moments, and also just seeing the response that people had to me in the community doing just everyday community leadership and things like that in response to it, it made me realize that I needed to just try to make a bigger impact in the Santa Cruz Valley, and just stand for something and bigger. And that actually one of those things was what kind of helped strike me that I needed to run for office at a young age, and that a student needed to be on the school board somewhere. And I want to just be honest about that, because that definitely made politics and things like that, and issues happening across the board, all of these things were personal to me, so they hit close to home. And so that kind of, all of these different things having skin in the game made my advocacy and different topics like that very emotional, and giving me some kind of basis for what I would do. I'm a Cancer too, so I'm very emotional. But I think that I just wanted to just kind of include that. And I think many times, young leaders who get involved, especially at a particularly young age or at a very like rampant or active level, I think there's a lot of times that they might have skin in the game, so to say, or they might have something kind of personal that maybe guides them. And for me, I think that example is something that I think is important, and what I try to bring as a trustee, and what I have always tried to bring to government and advocacy and stuff like that. Because at the end of the day, I feel like a lot of our nation's consensus of politicians and government leaders is this stale, bureaucratic, like disconnected kind of thing. But if some of y'all are leaders, I'm not trying to do a blanket statement. I'm not trying to throw any shade or anything like that. But I'm simply trying to say, I think that in this kind of time, there is a desire, and what helped me be elected at such an unprecedented age, I think there was just this desire to shake things up. And in my opinion, I believe a lot of that has to do with one of my intentions when I talked about all these kind of personal topics and stuff like that, in regards to civics and stuff like that, is I tried to do the best I could to humanize advocacy, to bring a very empathetic, kind of passionate lens to it, because it was personal. When I talk about issues affecting the student body, or we implement policies or stuff like that, those are the students that I grew up with, or that I was raised with. When we talk about housing and homeless insecurity, or basic needs reform, like and issues concerning that has to do with students I know that slept in their cars, that were my own friends, right? When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or other topics like that, or maybe we wanted to open up something for LGBTQ students or something like that, those are my own friends who would come up to me, not just friends, but classmates and colleagues that would come up to me as a community college student and say, Sebastian, I was harassed, or I was discriminated against. So I think that's when we talk about being an agent of change in the community college system and across the board, in my opinion, I think that's one of the most important factors, is actually being connected to the communities you're advocating for. The disconnect that we have often in decision-making and in other political bodies, and I'm not necessarily just trying to single out the community college system. I think there's wonderful leaders across the board, but I think the reason I won at such a young age was I harnessed a lot of energy outside of just the community college dialogue. There's a need for change, I think, in just the greater community. And I still have much to learn. I'm a super young individual. I don't have all the answers, but I hope that some of my experiences can at least highlight certain things. I'll try to actually then transitioned into more of the actual race itself. After Saugus High School, I graduated from Saugus High School. Then I attended College of the Canyons. Um, and it's interesting too, because like I said earlier, there was like this stigma that somehow, you know, community college students couldn't be leaders, or it was almost like a bad decision to choose community college. That was like the accepted norm from the high school, college, university recruitment process, that you have to go straight to 4-year. If you go to community college, somehow like you can't make change, or somehow you're not a good student, which is totally ridiculous. Totally ridiculous. Going to community college was easily the best choice of my life. Totally. And when I entered College of the Canyons, I was involved in a variety of things, and our community actually became a national hotbed for a super big like congressional race and different races like that. So our community became a very kind of politically active community. And I had this goal that I need to mobilize young people to vote, register them to vote from a nonpartisan perspective. And I actually worked on Patty Robinson with that too, back in 2018 during the midterms. And I know that because of efforts by Patty and other student leaders and stuff like that, that our college won civic engagement awards and things like that for unprecedented voter turnout. So I kind of committed myself to trying to mobilize people, but trying to do it from a little more of a nonpartisan kind of civic engagement lens. And that had a big impact on me. And so I was also partnered with this group called Next Gen America, and their whole goal was about like revolutionizing the youth vote. That was like their whole kind of goal. And I was active in those efforts. And when I would be active in those, I would be registering students, hundreds across the College of the Canyons campus. And I would talk to them, and I would hear their concerns and everything. And I would just kind of realizing like, oh man, like there's this consensus, right? Because young voters don't participate at all of the equal rates that older voters do. There's this consensus at least that young people are apathetic, that, you know, Generation Z or whatever is just picking their nose, and all they do is just go on TikTok, and they don't care about any issues, and they're just lazy and all that. I challenge all those narratives. Of course, you know, maybe there's a little bit too much TikTok usage and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, some of those platforms can actually be used on a positive level too. But not just that, my own experiences, I saw how unbelievably active and socially conscious and passionate community college students were about issues. And all young people that were excited to vote, they just didn't know how, or they didn't have the right resources, or maybe the infrastructure's in place didn't have enough young people or people that looked like them or came from their backgrounds. And so I think there's a reason historically why maybe some populations don't vote or turn out at certain rates. And a lot of times people try to just blame the individuals or the communities instead of maybe blaming the systems or the culture or the environment or the historical environments of civic engagement procedures, or who leads them. And so when I was involved in that congressional election 2018, we saw the highest youth voter turnout, I believe, in the history of the United States of America. I'm fairly sure it was. The statistic could be wrong. Forgive me if it is. But I believe that was the unprecedented youth voter turnout. And then it just made me think. And I also started partnering with the Associated Student Government while doing that. And then I was like, oh snap. Okay, there's actually something here. And then I realized that there actually can be affected change within a school kind of level. And so then I decided to then, I said, screw it. I feel like I saw this energy and support for all the campaigns I was doing around campus. I said, you know what, I'm gonna run for student body president. I just felt this urge. Like people were telling me I should do it. I would be like a perfect fit. And I said, I'm just gonna go for it. And it was such an exciting campaign. And we saw this active participation. And prior to that, and I don't want to say prior to that because there was great student government leaders throughout it, but a lot of the consensus that I would hear like from people was like, oh, community college students, they don't care, or like they don't want to be involved in student government, they don't want to vote. When I was running, I remember there was just like this liveliness, like people, like students really wanted to vote in the community college student government. They really were excited about issues. They really cared about their fees or things on campus and stuff like that. And so then I won Associated Student Government President in a very exciting election. And I had a bunch of campaign platforms on things like student hunger, student homelessness, advocacy, civic engagement, and things that actually had to do with DEI too. I remember I was a pretty big champion because of some of my colleagues on the importance of highlighting Hispanic serving institutions. Our student body had diversified throughout the years. And not only do we serve students in the Santa Cruz Valley, but there's a lot of community students from Antelope Valley and the San Fernando Valley and the LA County area. Our student body is majority minority at College of the Canyons. Hispanic serving institutions designation is 25%. COC is like reaching 50. And so there was this kind of new kind of equity kind of movement. You can read this book, Gina and Garcia. It's like super exciting. And it talks about trying to like eliminate equity barriers in the community college system for all students, Black, Indigenous, whatever it may be, disabilities, veterans, et cetera. But it also highlights Latino, Latina students in that. And the reality that the largest growing block in the California community college system are Latino students. If they graduate still at these uncomparable rates, only 2% of Latino students get their AA in 2 years, even though we are 2-year institutions. I think that's something that's a statistic that should motivate everybody to action, right? And I was reading this book and having these conversations before the DEI and that started going really, really aggressively on the statewide system with the state chancellor's office and stuff like that. And there was a lot of passion for that prior. And so that kind of played a role too in some of my own kind of connections to ways I could kind of influence change on the community college system from the student government lens. Then I was just, finishing my term. I loved being student body president. I saw a really exciting reaction to a lot of things I was doing. I led with colleagues on stuff like environmental sustainability, mental health advocacy, whatever it was. And then the pandemic happens. And so this is one of those moments where just like, life forever changes, right? That's like when the world forever changed, and like, it was crazy times, when people were like buying like boxes of toilet paper and all that chaos and all that. The pandemic happens, and no one could have really predicted. Well, I guess some people may have predicted certain challenges that come, but I guess it was one of those kinds of moments in time that just kind of flipped everything. And so I had to graduate online from my community college, and then I had to transfer to UCLA online. And that whole experience and that whole year was just this kind of like crazy kind of just like oddball experience. And it was like this I view it as one of the biggest disruptions to public education really in US history. And I think a lot of that as well also kind of, as someone that was starting to get involved on a student leader advocacy kind of level and seeing energy and student leaders across the state, rising to the task, that kind of moment too, like where you were seeing this really active advocacy. And so, I see someone in the chat. The chat is Becoming Hispanic Serving Institutions by Gina and Garcia. But anyways, the pandemic was this kind of, obviously this kind of unprecedented moment that just kind of shook everything up out of nowhere. And because of that, there was a lot of, I'll just, try to tell like it is, there's a lot of pain in the world. There was a lot of stress and anxiety from students and from people across the board. And there's this kind of just need for change. It was a brutal year, 2020 was rough. On top of that too, I was forced to go online. And so my entire education experience was abrupted. And so I couldn't move to Westwood and stuff like that. And so it just kind of shifted everything. And I spent so much of my life, building up to finally getting to UCLA, finally getting to like that exciting university, because I wasn't able to get in from high school, and community college gave me a second opportunity. But I dedicated so much, I hustled and sacrificed so much to finally experience what it was like to be at a university. And I went to community college and didn't experience the first 2 years of a full-time not a full-time of a UC kind of process. And I was like heartbroken and I was devastated. But then I thought, and this is maybe only kind of a Sebastian thing, but other young students, I'm seeing some other excitement for some possible other campaigns happening for their own school districts. But I think this is a pretty niche thing that maybe only Sebastian would think. I thought, okay, if I'm stuck at home, what can I do in my power? I said, screw it, I'm gonna run for public office. That was my solution. I was like, I had to do everything in my power as a human being to give back to people and to inspire people during these dark times. And I remember having all these different thoughts on what happened in Saugus. And I was also, hearing just a kind of like need for change from a variety of things, whether it was from the 2018 election and the historic youth voter turnout to the fact that different people were winning local office and school boards and water boards, et cetera, that there was a desire for change as well too. And there's a desire for, I would just hear a lot of encouragement before the pandemic. And even before I ran for student body president, I would just hear a lot of energy in the air that like, there's a desire for a young, more fiery leader from a diverse background to run for office in this community. I would constantly hear encouragement before. And so when the pandemic happened, and my College of the Canyons board was also up for re-election. And this also didn't make everybody happy. I'm just gonna be honest. I ruffled feathers, and I think I'm still ruffling feathers, but I guess that's part of the process for change. I guess that's we're in political conversations and like leadership and decision making. So you're not gonna satisfy everybody. But I remember when I announced my campaign, some people were upset. Some people were like, "Oh my God, what are you doing, Sebastian?" But I felt this kind of urge, and I said, you know what? I feel this calling, like I need to run for office. And I know I can pull it off. And people thought I was crazy, but then there was some people that said, you're gonna win. I know it. They said, like, this is exactly the kind of energy that's needed at the moment. Then the way that I'm talking about, the way kind of just things just happen, right? Like the way of the universe, of the pandemic. If UCLA didn't go online, I never would have been able to run and stuff like that. Then when June happens, right when I launch my campaign, and I was focusing, on a more community college level. I was very passionate too about not just the student body and advocating for students, but a variety of different things throughout the system. Passionate about teachers and staff and part-time faculty too, and trying to highlight some maybe the struggles that maybe adjunct faculty would endure on the statewide system. So I came in with support from labor and education endorsements and the teachers endorsements and stuff like that. But I was kind of just, I didn't expect the campaign to have the level of energy it did, because I was just going to focus purely on COC. But then right when I launched, it so happened that the movement for George Floyd blows up right when I launch. And I did not expect it, but I also kind of had a little like sense, like I had like this kind of feeling in the air, like something was about to go crazy this summer. And I had a feeling it was going to have to do with, maybe, conversations about equity and things like that. So George Floyd explodes. And right when I launch, our city kind of has this unprecedented youth movement for Black lives and for people of color in general throughout the community. And I feel like our town's history, we usually wouldn't have things like that. So when it peaked, my announcement for the community college board, I ended up channeling all of the energy, and I ended up kind of having this even bigger platform than I expected. It's definitely calmed down now, for sure. It's definitely calmed down, and it's been kind of chill for, even after, I first won the election. But again, I thought that was a kind of testament too to the need for change, because that was a community college student driven like movement, high school students too, and students from all levels. But like one of the biggest groups that led that was community college students. And California Community College system is the system that enrolls the largest share of students from historically underrepresented backgrounds. And so I think there's a lot of relevance that into the work that we do. That kind of energy, right? When, we saw the largest civil uprising and one of the largest civil uprisings in American history. And also in my community too, there was also very active, it kind of created another kind of like local active movement for change, and also I saw very active like desire for like Latino civil rights too. All of those things ended up kind of propelling me to having this way bigger platform and energy than I anticipated. Now, of course, I want to focus, a lot on the California Community College, like the inner workings of working in your community college system and stuff like that. And I don't want to get too off topic, but I do think it's relevant, especially because of the fact that that movement is what I think propelled, the DEI policy desires, and that had an impact. And you go to every statewide conference and you hear all these talks about like DEI and stuff like that. So it's constant. I think a lot of it had to do with that moment. But I think again, it's important to highlight that whatever it is we do in our decision making, the best possible we can do to meet people on the ground and come from this perspective that a lot of students who are historically left out of the conversation in many conversations or discourse, I think historically too, we have this kind of narrative like, oh, it's their fault because the student wasn't trying hard enough. Instead of looking at what is institutionally within the system that is not allowing for an equitable graduation or transfer rate or success at an institution. But I'm sure that I know that there's been people who are in this room that have probably maybe I'm just preaching to the choir. Maybe y'all have been championing stuff like this for a while too. But I wanted to at least kind of highlight that much of that movement and much of the fact that my election was coincided by young people organizing and being active and wanting change and wanting to fight institutional racism, and how that coincided also with the community college system and DI and everything like that. Those were all connected. It wasn't everything though, of course, either. There's a lot of ways where I simply just won my election, highlighting different topics, being a product of our public schools, talking about things like taxpayer dollars and transparent government and being a young voice that's connected to the student body, because oftentimes I felt like decision making across the board is often led on a trustee level, and all respect to service for anybody who takes on that job. But I feel a lot of times, even across the statewide system, there's some consensus of this, like with the Cal Community College, the statewide student senate, that oftentimes people in decision making are individuals who maybe like haven't attended a community college or felt the student experience in decades, and how important it is to have students in leadership that have had that immediate impact, experiencing what it's like to be a student, what it's like to transfer. And also because higher education, the student experience has completely transformed from what it was decades ago. The student debt crisis has exploded from what it was decades ago. There's a variety of ways that education and the student experience at this period is completely transformed from what it was decades ago. But I think in some ways there are individuals, or there is just this lack of young people in those decision makings or in maybe some of those higher up positions, even though the whole intention of the institution is to serve those students. And so I kind of campaigned on that, and I attracted support from across the board, even people who maybe weren't passionate about DEI or equity and stuff like that too. It was still a nonpartisan election, and there was conflicting opinions about different topics that was affecting national campaigns and stuff like that too. And so it wasn't like I was only focusing just on that. And I noticed there were people from all sides that when they saw me as a student body president, as someone who was actually elected by the student body, who was doing the work, who was a product of the school, they thought, you know what, it makes sense. Why don't we have more young people in elected office, especially if it's an educational institution? The whole purpose of that institution is to serve students. So yeah, that's some of the story, and I hit the I canvassed way too much. I honestly, if I'm being fully honest about my experiences, I had like almost like broke down. I campaigned and I took on full-time university and work and all the organizing in the summer with um my fellow young people in the movement, and winning public office, and then becoming a governing board member, and then all of that. It was too much. I was burnt out to the max. It almost nearly like killed me, if I'm being fully honest. I had activism burnout, but I want to be honest about that experience, because that's some of the experiences of some of young leaders when it comes to their work. It feels like the world's on their shoulders and stuff like that. I hope that I provided some kind of, exciting perspective or anything like that. But I've continued. I've served now officially a year on the College of the Canes Board of Trustees. I've done everything I can. Sometimes I wish I could do more. Sometimes I beat myself up after meetings because I'm frustrated. I feel like maybe I didn't advocate good enough, or maybe there isn't enough change happening, or maybe I'm not living up to what maybe voters or what young people expected out of me, stuff like that. I still find it to be this kind of, challenge where I'm constantly, trying to strive to be the best I can. And I welcome anybody here too to provide any different perspectives to me if there's ways that I can be better. And I think that that's something that we all could strive towards. I guess before I open up to a Q&A kind of section, I guess I'll just try to have some kind of concluding thoughts. And after serving a year on the Board of Trustees, and now being the clerk on the school board, which is pretty exciting, I think that there's just my own experiences. I think there's really a potential to impact and influence change. And when we talk about being an agent of change, I think it's one of those core aspects is that any small action can lead to that. And it starts with us, right? I never really would have thought the things that I would do would inspire the amount of young people it did. I didn't, really think that it would have had the level of impact it had. And all of it started off was me just being like an upset student who was angry at what was going on in the country. And I was just registering voters, and I couldn't get into the universities I wanted to in high school. And I used to think I was like this failure student and all this kind of stuff like that. Never would have, I never even thought I would have made it to that level. And now being the, youngest elected official in the history of my community, and graduating UCLA. And I just got in the master's too of public affairs too at UCLA for graduate school. Years ago, I never would have thought I would have been able to accomplish any of this. And a lot of it just happened, and a lot of things led to that by just me just taking the first step. Like, I want to make a difference in a student's lives. I want to register that student vote. I had no clue that registering that student vote and then registering that one and doing a voter registration event would lead to people saying, you should run for this and that and that. And then what's that has led to. And now, at the moment, I'm talking to other young leaders who are trying to run for the school board in a variety of areas in LA County and stuff like that, or run for office in the state. And it's an exciting kind of prospect that obviously it wasn't all just attributed to me, and conversations for change should be on a kind of, in my opinion, like a more communal, collective level. But the fact that some of my own actions that I never would have thought would have led to that, I've seen it make a difference in people's lives, like deeply, and has inspired them to be leaders in their own ways. And I think that's really powerful. And so whatever role you play, maybe it's not a trustee, maybe it's a completely opposite or separate role. But I think it all has relevance because I think our system is built in a way where we're all kind of connected, and collegial consultation is very important and pressing. I think no matter what it is you do, I think it hopefully it can inspire you or give you some kind of passion or fuel or something, that just like a conversation with someone, or attending one, event, or registering one voter, or just little things like that. Something as simple as that can lead to some kind of substantial change or some kind of exciting thing, or maybe that will inspire someone to do something else. And so I hope that maybe gave you a little bit of hope or some kind of inspiration. I know we have a little time left, so if there's any questions or things you'd like to elaborate on, or you would like to ask me, I would love to respond. Again, apologies about being nasally. I'm so mad that I sound all congested. That's so sad. But if anybody has any questions or anything like that, it was an honor to speak to y'all, and thank you for all for hearing me out. I really appreciate it.
Sebastian, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. For those of you, I know